There was no smoke over Elias Voss's cabin that morning. Every other chimney along the valley was pouring gray breath into a sky the color of iron. Wood smoke rolled off every roof for 2 miles, thick, urgent, the smell of families burning through their reserves faster than the season allowed. But the little house by the frozen bend of the river stood quiet. No smoke, no frantic axe against the cold. Just a thin curl of warmth rising so gently that a man riding past almost mistook the house for empty. It was not empty. Inside, a boy named Caleb slept without coughing for the first time in 3 weeks, and a wall of gray river stone held a warmth that had no business being there. Not that many hours after the fire had gone quiet. 3 months earlier, the same wall had almost killed them both with smoke. 3 months earlier, the neighbors had said Elias Voss was wasting the only thing a poor widower could not afford to waste, which was time. Stacking stones from a freezing river, while other men were cutting wood, carrying weight instead of carrying warmth. They were wrong about what he was building, and by midwinter they would be standing in his doorway, hats in their hands, asking him to explain it. This is a story of how a blacksmith with almost no money and a sick child figured out something most of his neighbors had never had a reason to learn, that a wall could remember fire long after the flames were gone, and how nearly losing everything to smoke was the only way he found out how to save it. Elias Voss measured his firewood the way other men measure money, because for him, that year, it was the same thing. He stood at the edge of the woodpile behind the cabin on a morning in late October, doing the arithmetic he had already done 4 times that week, hoping the answer might change. It never did. Even stacked as tightly as his aching hands could manage, the wood came perhaps 4 cords, maybe a little more if he counted the smaller, crooked pieces he had been saving out of stubbornness rather than usefulness. 4 cords. In an ordinary winter, on this stretch of river where the wind came down off the ridge with nothing to slow it, a family needed closer to 7 or 8. This would not be an ordinary winter. The geese had left 3 weeks early. The river had begun skinning over with ice before the harvest was fully in. Old-timers along the valley were already predicting a long, hard season, the kind that arrived early and stayed late, the kind that did not politely wait for a man to prepare. Elias was not an old-timer. He was 34, a blacksmith by trade, a German immigrant who had crossed an ocean with a young wife and a set of tools, and who was now, 11 months after burying that wife, raising a 5-year-old son alone on a piece of land that had come cheap for reasons the previous owner had never fully explained. Caleb coughed from inside the cabin. It was the 3rd time that morning, a dry, tearing sound that had started 2 weeks earlier and had not gone away. The local doctor, when Elias could afford to ask him, had said only that the boy needed to stay warm, needed to stay dry, needed rest and heat and time. Heat cost wood cost money Elias did not have, or hours he could not spare from the forge that fed them both. He looked at the 4 thin cords and then at the cabin, where his son's cough rattled again to the cold morning air, and he understood, with the flat clarity of a man out of easy options, that cutting more was not going to be enough. There was not enough forest left on his small plot to cut, not enough money to buy, and not enough time before the first real snow to solve the problem the way everyone around him solved it. He would have to solve it a different way. He did not yet know what that way was. The idea came to him the way most good ideas come to desperate men, sideways, while he was doing something else entirely. He was down the river 2 days later, breaking a skin of ice to fill a bucket, when his boot caught against a stone the size of a loaf of bread. He nearly went down, swearing under his breath in German, the way he still did when no one was listening. He bent to shove the stone aside and stopped. The stone was heavy, heavier than its size suggested. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the density of it, the tight gray grain, water smooth and cold as the river itself. Somewhere in the back of his memory, from a childhood workshop in a village near the Rhine, something stirred, a half-remembered image of a wall, Not a fireplace exactly. Something wider, thicker, built by an old relative whose name Elias could no longer recall. A wall that stayed warm long after the fire in front of it had burned to ash. He did not have a plan yet. He had only a stone in his hand, and a boy coughing in a cabin with not enough wood to last the winter. Over the following days, Elias began doing something his neighbors found first curious, then troubling. Instead of splitting more timber, he waded into the shallows of a freezing river, testing stones with his hands, rejecting most of them, keeping only the ones that felt unusually dense for their size. He carried them up the bank 1 and 2 at a time, his hands raw and cracking in the cold, and stacked them beside the cabin in a pile that grew taller every day and meant nothing to anyone who saw it. A neighbor's boy, riding past on an errand, stopped to stare at the pile and then at Elias and asked, with the blunt honesty only children manage, why he was building a wall of rocks instead of getting ready for winter. Elias did not have a good answer. He gave the boy an approximate one, that some stone held heat differently than wood or air, that his family, generations back, had built something like this in the old country. He did not say that he was working from a fragment of memory that was 30 years old and belonged, strictly speaking, to someone else. He did not say that he had never actually built one of these himself, only seen one, once, as a child too young to understand what he was looking at. By the second week, the stone pile was taller than Caleb, and the wood pile, which he was still cutting into in small amounts each day to keep the current fire going, had not grown at all. Thomas Rourke had farmed the valley for 19 years, which was long enough to have survived 4 winters that killed livestock and one that killed a neighbor, and he did not consider himself a cruel man, only a practical one. So he rode over to see what Elias Voss was building beside his cabin. His questions were not meant as mockery. They were meant as a warning. "Stone doesn't burn," Rourke said, standing beside the growing pile with his hands tucked under his arms against the cold. "You know that. I know you know that." "It doesn't need to burn," Elias said. "Then what good is it doing you, sitting there instead of wood in your box?" It was a fair question, and Elias did not have a fully satisfying answer, because he had not built the thing yet. He explained what he remembered, that a wall of stone set the right way around a fire could take in the heat while the fire was burning and give it back for hours after the fire had gone out, so that a family needed fewer separate fires and less wood overall to stay warm through a night. Rourke listened and did not laugh, which Elias appreciated, but he shook his head slowly when Elias finished. "I've seen men try clever things with stone before," Rourke said. "Fireplace chimneys that draw wrong and fill the whole house with smoke. Walls that crack apart from the heat inside a season, and you're left worse off than before, colder, and out however many days you spent hauling rock instead of cutting timber." He looked at the sky, gray and low, the kind of sky that meant early snow. "You've got maybe 3 weeks before the ground freezes hard enough that you can't dig proper footings for whatever you're building. And you're spending those weeks carrying stones out of a river that's already trying to ice over." He was not wrong about any of it. That was what made the conversation difficult. Elias had watched other men's clever solutions fail before. A smokehouse that never cured meat properly. A well someone dug in the wrong spot and struck nothing but mud. Rourke's caution came from real losses, not from small-mindedness, and Elias respected that even as he found himself unable to simply agree and go back to cutting wood. "I don't have enough wood for the winter regardless," Elias said finally, "not by half. So I can spend 3 weeks doing what everyone else is doing and still come up short in February. Or I can spend those weeks trying something that might mean I need less wood altogether." Rourke studied him for a long moment, then looked past him at the cabin, where Caleb's cough carried faintly through the closed door. "Your boy doesn't have until February to find out you were wrong," he said, not unkindly, and rode off without saying whether he thought Elias was foolish or simply out of better choices. Elias stood by the stone pile a long time after Rourke left, the cold working into his hands. and understood that Rourke had said the one thing he could not argue with. There was one man in the valley who might know something more than a half-remembered childhood image, and Elias went to find him the next morning. Old Halvorsen had come from somewhere in northern Europe decades earlier. Nobody in the valley was entirely certain where, and he had worked stone and iron both before his hands grew too stiff with age to manage the heavier work. He lived alone in a small house 2 miles upriver, and the local children were faintly afraid of him, which meant most adults rarely bothered him either. Elias had traded work with him twice, mending tools in exchange for advice on tempering steel, and it was the only reason he felt he had any right to knock on the old man's door and ask about a wall he barely remembered from his own childhood. Halvorsen listened to Elias describe the stone pile, the shape he was imagining, the fragment of memory about a wall that held fire's warmth long after the flames were out. The old man's face did something complicated, somewhere between recognition and doubt. "I have seen such a thing," he said slowly, choosing his English carefully, the way he did when a subject mattered to him. "Not in this country. Built into the middle of a house, not against an outside wall, like your ordinary fireplace. The fire burns inside a chamber of brick or stone, and the smoke does not go straight up and out. It is made to travel back and forth through channels inside the mass of the wall before it finally escapes. The stone holds the heat from that long, slow path of smoke and gives it back to the room for many hours." It was more than Elias had known that morning, and also less than he needed. Halvorsen could describe the idea of it, the principle, but admitted freely that he had only watched such a stove being used as a boy, never built one himself, and that the exact proportions, the size of the channels, the placement of dampers to control the smoke's path, were details he had never learned and could not now recall with any confidence. "If you build the channels wrong," Halvorsen warned, "the smoke will not want to travel where you intend. It will find the easiest way out, which may be back into your house instead of up through your roof. I have heard of men nearly killed that way, filling a cabin with smoke in the middle of the night." Elias thanked him and walked home with more understanding and more uncertainty at the same time, which was, he was beginning to realize, simply the condition of doing something no one nearby had actually done before. He would be building from a description, a memory of a memory, and testing the rest by trial. The stones were ready. The design was not. And the season was not waiting for him, to be certain. Elias worked for 9 days on the structure, using what Halvorsen had described as a rough map and his own blacksmith's instinct for how heat and air moved through iron and stone alike. He built the fire chamber low and close to the cabin's existing hearth, then stacked the river stone above and around it into a thick mass, leaving narrow channels inside for the smoke to wind through before escaping up a short flue near the roofline. It was crude, heavier than anything he had built before, and by the time he finished, his hands were cut in a dozen small places from the rough stone, and his back ached in ways it had not since the crossing from Germany. On the 10th evening, with Caleb wrapped in every blanket the cabin owned and watching from the corner with wide, hopeful eyes, Elias lit the first fire inside the new chamber. For the first 20 minutes, it seemed to work. The fire drew well, the smoke disappearing up into the channels as intended, and Elias allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, something close to relief. Then the wind shifted outside, gusting hard down off the ridge the way it often did after sundown, and the smoke stopped rising the way it should. It hesitated at the mouth of the flue, seemed to think better of it, and began instead to push backward, out through the gaps around the fire chamber's opening and into the room. Within minutes a cabin filled with a gray haze that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. Caleb, whose lungs were already weakened from weeks of coughing, began to choke, a hard, frightened, gasping sound that sent Elias's heart into his throat far faster than any smoke could. He threw open the door and the single window, scooped his son up and out into the freezing night air, and stood there holding him while the boy coughed and coughed against his shoulder, the cabin behind them venting smoke into the darkness like something confessing a failure. It took nearly half an hour for the air inside to clear enough that they could return, and by then the fire had burned down to embers. The great stone mass barely warmed at all that labor and all that hope amounting, on its first real test, to a coughing child in the smoke-blackened room. Rourke's warning came back to him whole in that moment, uninvited and entirely fair. He had built something dangerous instead of something useful, and he had done it with his son inside the house. Elias did not sleep that night. He sat beside Caleb's bed until the boy's breathing settled into something even and undisturbed, and then he went back out into the cold, alone with a lantern, to study the thing he had built. He was not ready to give up on it. He was, however, finally ready to admit that guessing was not the same as understanding, and that if he built the channels wrong a second time, he might not get a third chance before the real cold arrived. So instead of rebuilding immediately, he spent the following 2 days simply observing. He lit small test fires, deliberately modest ones, and watched with his hand near the openings, feeling for where air pulled in and where it pushed back out. He held a thin strip of cloth near different gaps in the stonework and watched which way it moved, which way the draft actually wanted to travel, rather than the way he had assumed it would. What he found surprised him. The channels he had built were too narrow in one section and too wide in another, which meant the smoke, instead of moving in one steady, patient path, was rushing to the wide section and then crowding up against the narrow one, exactly the kind of pressure that would send it backward the moment an outside gust disturbed the balance. Halvorsen had mentioned dampers, a way of controlling the smoke's path, and Elias understood now, with his hand near the warm stone, why that detail mattered as much as it did. Without some way to steady the draft against the wind, the whole design was only as reliable as a calm evening. He widened the narrow section with a chisel, evening the channel's width along its length. He fashioned a simple iron plate hinge that could be adjusted to control how much air the fire pulled in, something he could manage with the same hands that shaped horseshoes at his forge. It was not an elegant solution. It was a blacksmith solution, practical, adjustable, built from what he had rather than what he wished he had. Rourke rode past again on the second day and found Elias chiseling stone in the cold with visible cuts still healing on his knuckles. Heard about the smoke, Rourke said, not unkindly but not gently either. Caleb all right? He's all right, Elias said, not looking up from his work. It was the channels. Too narrow in one place. I understand it now. Rourke did not answer right away. He watched Elias work for a while, the careful, patient adjustments of a man correcting a real mistake rather than abandoning an idea, and something in his expression shifted, not into belief exactly, but into something less certain than before. You'll test it again before the real cold, he said. It was not quite a question. I have to, Elias said. There isn't another choice left. He lit the corrected fire on an evening that offered nothing dramatic, no storm, no wind worth mentioning. Simply an ordinary cold night in mid-November, the kind the valley had 100 of every year. Elias had chosen it deliberately. He did not want his second real test complicated by anything he could not control. He wanted to know, on the plainest terms possible, whether the structure itself worked. This time the smoke drew steadily, disappearing into the widened channel, and up through flew without hesitation, without the anxious backward hitch that had filled the cabin before. Elias sat close by for hours, watching, adjusting the iron damper by small degrees, learning by feel how much air the fire wanted. Caleb, no longer wrapped in every blanket in the house, sat closer to the stone mass than to the fire itself, his small hands pressed flat against the surface, and reported, with the plain seriousness of a 5-year-old delivering important news, that it was warm. By midnight, the fire had burned down to a bed of quiet coals, and Elias, exhausted, allowed himself to bank it low and go to sleep, uncertain what he would find in the morning. What he found, when he woke before dawn out of habit and cold weather caution, was a wall that was not hot, not the kind of heat that would burn a careless hand, but distinctly warmer than the cabin's air, warmer than the floor, warm enough that Caleb, waking shortly after, walked straight to it and leaned his back against the stone without being told to. The fire itself had been out for hours. The room had not gone cold with it. Elias stood in the gray early light doing the same arithmetic he had done in October, except the numbers had changed. He had burned perhaps half the wood he would have needed for an ordinary fire to keep the cabin at the same temperature through the same stretch of night. Half, not because the stone had made heat out of nothing, which he understood well enough was impossible, but because it had captured heat that a normal fire simply let escape up the chimney and out into the cold air, and had returned that heat slowly, patiently, long after the flames themselves had gone quiet. It was not yet proof against a true winter storm. One calm, ordinary night was not the same as a blizzard-driving wind against every seam in the stonework, but it was the first solid evidence that the idea, however imperfectly it had begun, was not foolish. Elias allowed himself, for the first time since October, to believe he might actually make it through the season. The storm that mattered arrived in the second week of January, and it arrived the way the old-timers had predicted back in October. Early in the season's memory, but savage when it finally came. The wind began building at midday, and by nightfall it was driving snow sideways hard enough that a man could lose the path between his own cabin and his own barn. Elias fed the fire chamber with more wood than usual that night, aware that a storm like this would test the design in ways a calm November evening never could. He adjusted the iron damper carefully against the shifting wind, watching for any sign of the backward hitch that had filled his cabin with smoke months earlier. It held. The channels he had corrected kept the draft steady even as gusts hammered the outside of the cabin, and by the time he and Caleb settled in for the night, the great stone mass was radiating a steady, dependable warmth that made the howling outside feel almost distant. Sometime past midnight, a fist pounded on the door. It was Thomas Rourke, half frozen, his wife and 2 children behind him wrapped in every blanket they owned, snow crusted thick on all of them. Their own chimney, an ordinary stone fireplace built the conventional way against an outside wall, had developed a crack from the extreme cold, and the fire they depended on had begun drawing badly, filling their house with smoke exactly the way Elias's structure once had. With the storm raging and no safe way to keep a fire burning inside their own home, they had no choice but to walk through the blizzard to the nearest neighbor. Elias did not hesitate, and did not mention, in that moment, anything about October or about the doubts Rourke had voiced beside the growing stone pile. He simply opened the door wider and brought them in out of the storm. The Rourke family spent the rest of that night crowded into the small cabin, warmed by the same wall Rourke had once called a waste of 3 good weeks. The children stopped shivering within the hour. Rourke himself said very little, sitting near the stone with his hands pressed against it the same way Caleb had months before, watching the fire burn low in the wall, keep giving warmth back long after most fires would have surrendered the room to cold. By morning the storm had not fully broken, but it eased enough to see the shape of the yard again, the woodpile half buried in drifted snow, the river frozen solid where Elias had once waited for stones. Rourke stood at the door preparing to make the difficult walk back to assess his own damaged chimney, and turned back once before stepping out into the wind. "I was wrong about the 3 weeks," he said. It was all he said. It was, from a man like Rourke, enough. By the time the last hard freeze broke in early spring, the story of Elias Voss's stone chimney had traveled the length of the valley the way any good story does in a small community, retold, exaggerated slightly with each telling, but carrying at its center a fact no one could dispute. A blacksmith with less wood than anyone else had made it through the coldest winter in a decade with what left over, while men with fuller wood piles had come dangerously close to running out. Rourke was the first to ask Elias to help him rebuild his own damaged fireplace along the same principle, and he was not the last. Through the spring, Elias found himself doing as much work with stone and iron as he did at his forge, teaching neighbors who had once found his riverstone pile faintly ridiculous how to shape channels that would hold a fire's warmth rather than simply letting it escape. He never claimed to have invented anything. He was honest every time about the fragment of childhood memory and an old blacksmith's incomplete recollection that had started the whole effort, and about the night the first attempt had nearly filled his cabin with smoke and sent his son into a fit of coughing that still returned to him sometimes in dreams. Caleb's cough, by contrast, was gone by February and did not come back that year. Whether the warmer, steadier heat of the rebuilt cabin deserved all the credit, or whether the boy would have recovered regardless, was not something Elias could prove with certainty, and he never claimed otherwise. What he could say, plainly, was that his son had slept through entire nights without waking to cough, for the first time since the previous autumn, and that the wall beside his bed had still been warm each of those mornings, hours after the fire went quiet. Old Halvorsen, when Elias visited him again that spring to thank him properly, only shrugged in a particular way a man who had watched a half-remembered idea from his youth prove itself useful in a country he had not expected to need it. He did not take credit. He said only that some old knowledge waited a long time to be needed again, and that it was not lost, only asleep, until someone had a good enough reason to go looking for it. The stone wall was never beautiful. It was uneven in places, patched where Elias's early corrections showed, plain gray river rock instead of dressed masonry. But that winter, in a cabin by a freezing river, it had not needed to be beautiful. It had only needed to remember the fire long after the fire itself had gone quiet, and give that memory back, slowly, to a boy who needed it more than anyone else in the valley. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.